Go ahead and try it out, build your own version of the game, and try out some of the functionality of jQuery as you build out the game. So this lesson is going to be creating a game exercise, and we're going to be building a whack-a-mole type game. So the objective of the game is to hit the moles as they show up on the screen. If you hit them, they get the skull and the crossbones, your score increases, and once you run out of moles, then that's where the game ends. So the objective is to hit as many of the 25 moles as possible within the time given. The code can dynamically adjust the number of holes. So right now we have it set to 12. We can update that to 20, and then that will allow us to have the gameplay a little bit more challenging. We can update this to whatever number we want, and it'll create the corresponding holes to accommodate the gameplay. You can also update the total number of moles that you want within the game. So right now we have it set at 25. Let's set it to 10. So this is, for this round, it's only going to show 10 moles, and that's going to end the round. If you click the mole, the scores are going to go up, and once you run out of moles, then that round is over. You can start the game again. So adjusting this, and this is just all because we're building the entire game board dynamically with jQuery. As we are generating the game board, and all of the elements on the page are also generated. So we don't have a lot of HTML to start with, and the objective is really just to get more familiar with jQuery and building out a game exercise. So we've got all of the game logic as well that we're going to be running through in this lesson. Let's start this exercise by creating an HTML file. I've added in some elements. We are going to need a message area, so this is where we can output information for the user, such as the score, and then also the game. So this is where the main game is going to take place, the main game board. And then I've also added a button, and then this is going to be where we can initially start the game. Let's apply some styling to the elements. So we are going to have a main game element. And for the main game element, let's set a margin of auto to it. And then padding, we'll set padding to 0 and set a max width of the element, and we'll set that to be 800 pixels. So that will create the main game board. We could also set a border for the main game. So set the border at 1 pixel solid. Let's also set up the styling. So we're going to have some page elements. So we're going to be generating this and doing all of this with jQuery. So we are going to have a hole. So this is going to be the main parent element that we're going to add in the mole and the dirt into. So add that, and we'll center align the text. And the moles images, they're all going to be text icons. So set this to a width of 25%, and then do a display, and we'll do an inline block. So inline block for the display property. And then the font size, because these are going to be font elements, we're going to make them rather large. So set them up at 4 EM. And for the mole class, so these are where we're going to be adding in the moles into. So by default, we're going to set a display property of none. And then we can update the cursor as well, and we'll set it to be the crosshair for the cursor. For the hit, so when the element does get hit, for now we're just going to do a display none. So this is going to be in line with the mole. So this is only going to show when we actually make a hit on the mole. And for the dirt, so this is where the mole is going to hide behind, and this is going to be the element that it's hiding behind. So let's just set a cursor, and the cursor that we can set for this one, how about we just set it to be grab. So now we've got all of the HTML and the styling set up. We've created a JS file, and we need to set some basic parameters. So let's set a global game object, and this is where all of the game data is going to sit, such as score. So we'll set the default score to be 0, and also for the game over. So this is going to give us a way to end the game. So right now the game is over, it's not in play, and we're going to adjust this when we start the game. The last hole that we had, we're going to track that. So we'll just set that to 0. And then the number of holes that we want to generate. So this is going to be a dynamically generated game. So we can update this value, and it'll update the number of holes. And then we'll also create a way to end the game. So we're going to show 25 moles, and the objective is going to be to try to hit as many of the moles as possible. So let's add a start event. where we can click the button with the ID of start. So that's that start button there. And then once that gets clicked, what we'll do is we'll kick off the start game function. We might want to make the button bigger as well. So for the start button, we can set some padding to it. We'll update the font size. And the reason we have an error is that I haven't set the function yet in order to start the game. So we can add, once I add that, that's going to update the game. So create the function and do the start game. So that would just be blank for now. And for the start button, since this needs to have an ID in order to select the button, so there's our start game button. We'll do a margin auto of the button and display of block, so that way we can center the button within the screen. So we click the start game button, and this is where the game is going to kick off. So what we want to do is we want to hide the button, so we don't want the users to have to be able to click it again. So just do a quick hide on the button. So once it gets clicked, the game is going to be in play. We're going to set the game over value, so the game over value, and set that to be false, because the game is going to be in play, so the game is not stopped, it's not over, and we want to set those values. Also, let's update the score, so setting the game score, and I know it's already set to 0, but when we start the game, we want to reset all of these back to the 0 values. And for the ender, we'll set the game ender, so this is going to be the countdown, how many moles we're going to be showing. So we'll set that back up at 25. So once we start the game, we also, before we start the game, we actually need to build the game board. So let's create a function that's going to be the make game board function. So we'll kick that one off as well. So whenever the game is ready and it loads, this is where we're going to make the game board. So we're going to add in all of the elements into the main element with a class of game. We're going to apply all of the elements and build the board from there. So we want to loop through and create the number of elements that we've got here. So we've got a value for game holes. That's how many holes we want to create. So we could do that setting up a for loop, set the value to 0, and then loop through while I is less than the game holes value. So the game holes value, and this will allow us to dynamically generate the number of holes that we want for the game board. And this is going to update depending on what we've got for the value of the game holes. So now let's create an element, and we're going to create a main parent div. And because we're creating an element, we're going to use the brackets in order to create the element using the jQuery. And we're going to assign it to a variable. So that way we can add in additional elements into it. And this is going to be just a way to add the code and make it a little bit cleaner. Of course, we can select the element and then add it. So this way, the code is going to be written statement by statement, because we're going to be adding several new elements into this main game element. So now that we've got the element within a variable, we can add a class to it. And the class that we're adding to it is going to be whole, but we also want to generate a random or a value for it, so a unique ID value or a unique class value to it. You can set it up as an attribute ID, or we can set it up as a class. So my preference is to use it as a class so that I can use the selection where I'm selecting the element with a class of. And this is going to be a unique class value that we're going to have for each one of the holes. And when we select a random hole, this is going to allow us to randomly select the hole with this particular value. So the value is going to be a value of 0 to whatever the value of I is. So we're just going to add that in, and the class is going to be unique, where it's going to have a class of hole plus the I value. So starting at hole 0 and going up to all the way up to 11 in this case, because we've got holes of 12. So let's add in another class, and this class that we're adding in is expecting a string parameter, and this is going to be the generated class. So these are all going to be different classes. And then lastly, we want to append it to append it to the element with a class of game. So let's see what happens when we make the board. And there's all of our page elements, and we've got nothing in them yet. So we've got a way to select them because they've got all unique classes. And as mentioned, you can do it within using IDs as well. So depending on what your preference is in order to make the selection of the elements. So both of them will work the same way. So the next one that we need to create is we need to create another div. And this div, we're going to add a class. And the class that we're adding is going to be a mole. And within the mole, we want to add the mole element image. And so this is going to be a little character creature like that, like a little mole-looking type icon. And then using append to, we're going to append that newly created element to the main div. And this is going to be where we've got the hole. So that's going to add all of them into the screen. Right now they're not going to be showing because I've got it on display none. But if we remove the display none, that shows out all of the moles that we're going to have. So we have them hidden because throughout the game we're going to show them and then we're going to hide the other elements. So let's do the same thing where we're going to add the actual dirt. And in this case, we're going to be adding an icon that's going to look like leaves. And you can select different icons as needed. And you can even add images if you want. So this is selecting a class of dirt. And those are the ones that are going to be showing on the screen. And then we're going to have the moles. We're going to hide the dirt, show the mole, and the moles are the ones that are going to be clickable in order to score within the game. So the other one that we want to add that whenever we've got a hit on the element, so that we have something that we can show in between the hits on the element. And we're appending these to the div as well. So that's a little skull and bones there. And this one as well is going to be hidden. And we're going to use that whenever we make the hit on the element. So there's our game board. And if we update this to 16, it's going to show in 16 squares. If we update it to a number like 14, so it's just going to be missing those two. So whatever number we have, it's going to basically build a board, and that will be all of the different elements that we could potentially have the mole within. So now that we've got the start game function, we want to kick off the start of the game. So we make our game board, and then we want to start the game. So we're going to create a function called starter, and that's going to start the whole process of where we're showing the moles and so on. So let's create that function, and this one is just called starter. And within here, we want to select the random mole. And because these ones have a unique class of hole, we just need to be able to generate a random mole value. So let's create an element and assign it to an element, a jQuery element. So I'm just using the variable L with the $sign in front of it. So that's going to indicate that this is going to be the jQuery object. And then for the jQuery object, we want to make a selection of the correct element. So we can use the selection and selecting the hole. And we also need to include the value of the hole that we want to select. So I'm going to create a function that will generate a random hole value, and it will return back the random hole value. So we'll generate a function in order to manage that. And then we'll output the element that has been selected into the console before we do anything else with the element. So let's run a function, create a function that's going to generate the random hole and return back a random hole value. And the reason I'm doing it within a separate function is because I want to track and make sure that I'm not opening up and showing one that's already being displayed. So we want to set a new value and set a new element. So doing the floor and then math random. And we're going to select a random value from 0 to just before the game holes value. And with the game holes value, once again, is the number of holes that we have on the game. So whatever value that is, that's the random number. So that's the max random number, not including that number. So because we're math flooring it, so that will give a possibility for the first element with the index value of 0 in order to be able to be selected for this. So now that we're generating the random value and the random hole, we can then select and apply to that random hole. So doing a check to see if the value of val is equal to game, and we've got a value for the last. So this is just going to ensure that our random hole is not going to be the one that we last set it to. So this will create some randomness. And if it is, then we're going to return back and go back to random hole until we end up with a value that's not going to be the same. So this will just call the function again, and it will go through and check to see if we're not the game last. And if we're not the game last, then we set the current value to the game last. So for the next iteration, this current val will be the game last value. And then we need to return back the value that we've generated. So now let's see what happens when we start the game within the console. So we're generating some random holes here. And well, actually, we're just generating the one. So this is the one where we want to actually show the mole within. And once we return that back within the element, so once we do have a random value there that we've got, we can use the show mole, or we can create a function to show the mole. So instead of logging it out into the console, create a function, call it show mole. And then within the show mole function, we'll pass in the jQuery object. And then from here, let's select the mole. And we're going to select under the element using the find method. We're going to find the element that has a class of dirt. And then using hide method, let's hide that element. We want to have a callback function. So I'm going to just set it to 0, so it'll hide it right away. And then we're going to take the element and find the element with a class of mole, and then we want to show that element. So let's see how that works. So click the start game. So that shows one of the moles. So we want to also create a timeout for this. So let's create a variable, call it timer, and then using math random. And we're going to actually just, we can use a math round. So it doesn't matter, we need just a random number for the timer. So let's multiply this, and this is going to be the number of milliseconds, and then plus 500 for how long it's going to show on the screen. And maybe actually I'm going to do 200. So we might have some that are really quick and some that could stay potentially 1200 milliseconds. So let's set the timeout. So setting the timeout method and then the callback on the timeout. So I'm using the arrow functions because I don't need to select any of that content. And the timeout is going to run on the timer that we've just generated. So within the timeout, what we want to do is we want to, once this times out, we still have the main parent element. So once again, we want to find the element with a class of dirt and then show that element. And we want to find the one with the mole and hide the mole. And in case the element has had a hit, let's go ahead and we're going to find hit as well, and we're going to hide that one. So this will handle in case we hit the mole, the hit is showing, and we're setting the timeout, so we're hiding those. So we want to make sure that we're hiding the hits as well that are contained within the main parent element. And then once we need to check to see if the game over value, so if that value is not false, or if that value is not true, then we're going to run the starter function again. So just invoke the starter function. So that will run the sequence again, selecting a random mole, and then running through this whole process. So hit the start the game. And so now we've got them showing up. So some of them we want to be able to click. So that's the next step, where we want to be able to click those moles as they're showing up. And so for that one, we're going to add a click event to the main game object and use the on method in order to attach the click events to the moles. And adding the on method and then click and selecting the element with a class of moles. So we only want to have the moles clickable. And then once it's hit, we'll run a function of hit mole. And let's create the function in order to handle the hitting of the mole. So hit mole function will select whatever the current element is. So using this function. And then we want to hide the parent and find the elements with a class of hit to show that element. So we're hiding the mole, and then from that parent we're traversing up to the parent, and from the parent we're finding the descendant of hit. So we're showing the hit, and then let's have a fade out of the hit. So we'll do a fairly quick fade out of it. So 200 milliseconds, and then create a function to manage the callback of whenever the hit occurs. And then we select this and parent to find the elements with a class of dirt, and we just want to show that one. So what the event is going to do is whenever we hit the mole, it's going to hide the mole, show the hit, and then do a fade out of the hit, and then once the hit disappears, it'll show the dirt element, the element with the class of dirt. So that should give us a way to click the moles, and we see we get the skull and crossbones there when we do click them. So when we successfully do have a click, then that means that we also want to update the score as well. So we've got a successful hit, and let's take the game score and we're going to update it by 1. So we also want to output the score to the player. So far we've got a fairly working version of the game. We've got a message area. So within the message area, and whatever the value is that we're passing here, we want to update the score property of it. So let's select the element with a class of message, and then we're going to build the HTML that we want to output in it, and we'll create a variable for the HTML. So this can be an element, and setting that up, we want to get the score, add the score in there, and that's coming from the game score. So for this, every time we update the score value, we're going to run the message function. And I don't know if we need to pass anything in right now. Let's see what happens. So that we've got the score being shown there. When we start the game as well, let's update the score. And we can also update the number of moles that are left within the score. So let's add this within a div. And then we'll create a separate div. And this will say moles left. And here we can have the game. And this is going to be where we've got the countdown of the number of moles that we have left. So game ender. So let's go through, and now we're going to be showing the number of moles that we have left. So every time we show a mole, we're going to subtract from the game ender. So subtract 1 from the game ender. And then we're going to have a condition that's going to check if game ender is greater than 0. and or actually we can check to see if it's less than or equal to 0. And if that's the case, then we want to game and end the game. So we had the game object, and let's set the game over to be true. So this will end the game. And then we also want to, as we've hidden the start button, we're going to show the start button once again. And then we can type within the message as well. We can type something like game over. So now selecting the elements, and we need to update the start button. So where we're hiding the start button when we start the game, we're going to show the start button. And this should actually stop the game. So we start the game. We need to also be updating the message every time we update the ender. So start the game, and that's going to tell us how many moles are left, how many we've scored, how many we've hit. And this is a way to keep score. We should make this a little bit bigger because it's a little bit hard to see. So we'll update that. And now we've got the game start once again. So we should be able to reset the score and start the game over again. So we can play through the game. And this gives us an ability to play through the game over and over again. So let's update some of the style properties to the element with a class of message. And we'll do a text align. So center align the text. And this can, maybe we want to set the background color. So set it to black. And then the color of the font can be white. Let's also update the font size. So set the font size to 2em. So let's see what that looks like. So now that's given us our score. So whenever we make a hit, we gain on the score. And as we play through the game, it gives us the update on how many are left. And then once that reaches 0, then that means that it's game over. And whatever we've scored, we've been able to score within this round. So the game has stopped, and then now we have an option to restart the game by pressing the Start Game button. So that shows up back on the score.